Hi everyone, this is Katie Edwards at the Nonprofit Centers Network. Thank you so much for joining us today for our webinar, Streamlining Social Good, Social Science and Resource Sharing. I am really excited for today's presentation and hope that you all get a lot out of it. We'll wait here for a moment as a few more people join the webinar, and we'll get started momentarily. All right. So let's go ahead and get started. So today's topic is streamlining social good, the social science and resource sharing. And I'm really excited to welcome you all today to our webinar. Looks like to me that the majority of you on the webinar are members of NCN or are very familiar with our services, but for those of you who aren't, we are a North American peer learning organization for nonprofit organizations that are interested in resource sharing, whether it be shared space or back office administrative services. And we have approximately 175 members all across the US and Canada. If you're a member of NCN, you get a host of benefits, including webinars like today's for free, along with access to our online resource center, discounts on events and publications, and a free 1 hour of consulting. So for the members who are on the line, don't forget about that hour of consulting. For more information or to schedule that hour, please contact Lena Waite, who is our newest team member. And as I mentioned earlier, I'm Katie Edwards. I'm the Associate Director of the Nonprofit Centers Network, and I'm joined here in Denver by my colleague Laura Jakubowski, our Executive Director. So today's webinar, only myself and our presenter, Sion Bonneau, will be audible today. However, we do hope that you participate by typing questions using the dashboard on the right-hand side of your screen. You'll be able to type a question and it will come to me, and we will read that question and share it with Sion. Please feel free to ask questions throughout today's webinar. We want it to be as interactive as possible, and there will also be some time at the end as well for more questions. So without further ado, let me introduce our presenter, Sion Bonneau. Sion is an assistant professor of economics at Swarthmore College. He's currently studying behavioral and public economics, and his areas of interest include pro-social behavior, environmental conservation behavior, development, and personal finance decisions. He primarily runs field experiments that seek to improve our understanding of decision-making with a variety of partners in the United States and abroad. Sion has a BA from Princeton University and an MA and PhD in public policy from Harvard. He received the Harvard Kennedy School Dean's Award for Excellence in Student Teaching in 2009, 2011, and 2012. We got connected with Sion in our planning for the Streamlining Social Good convening we held in Philadelphia back in April. Sion, through his research, was really able to name the categories of behavior that we see all too often in our work in collaboration. And we're so happy that Sion has agreed to join us today for a reprise of his keynote presentation to help all of us, even those of us who weren't able to travel to Philly, to help to better understand the human factor in our collaborations and give us some tools to address these issues in our daily work. So Sion, please take it away.
Great. Thank you very much, and I really appreciate the opportunity to reach out to a few more folks here. So I'll quickly sort of introduce myself so you can get some context. Also, I'm very aware of the fact that you guys can't see me, so I thought I'd put a picture of myself here. I look roughly like this, but in multiple more dimensions, I guess. And I'm an assistant professor at Swarthmore College, as was mentioned. A few other things that I also am engaged with. I'm a senior researcher at a group called the Yale Applied Cooperation Team, which is a team of researchers that works with partners out in real-world settings who are trying to increase cooperation in the real world. You know, we seek to kind of use social science insights to do that. So we work with organizations, we work with cities, we work with big government agencies in trying to improve their practices to incorporate more social science. And I also work with the Busara Center for Behavioral Economics, which is a behavioral economics research lab out in Kenya, where we study, again, behavioral economics related questions in low-income communities in the developing world. And as mentioned, my research is really about testing experimentally, so with the randomized control design, behavioral economics ideas in the real world. So how do we get people to change behavior, and how do we use social science to its utmost to do that? And just a short plug here, if this is something that seems of interest to you, where you or your organization might be motivated by some of these ideas and want to test behavioral strategies to change behavior, I'm always open to hearing from you all about that, and potentially getting involved with some of my research partners. Broadly speaking, I wanted to talk a bit about resource sharing here and really dig into how the social and behavioral sciences relate, and also what they are in general. So what I'm hoping to do with the session here is to run through some of these key biases or challenges as I perceive them from my position of not really knowing everything about what you guys deal with on a day-to-day basis, but certainly having some conceptual insights that I think are related to the work that you guys are trying to do. And of course that comes with the caveat that these are theoretical concepts and there's supporting evidence for them in the real world, but there's still a need for more and more evidence to see how these things work and don't work out in the real world that we all live in. But sort of hopefully, I'm thinking that if we become more aware of these issues conceptually, it may help us avoid them in reality. So I wanted to start with, if you've heard of an economist, I bet it's probably Adam Smith, who's famous for, among other things, this quote, which was in his treatise, I guess you could call it, The Wealth of Nations. It is not from the benevolence of the butcher, the brewer, or the baker that we expect our dinner, but from their regard to their own interests. So this has become sort of the canonical way of thinking about people in, I would say, economics for sure, and the social sciences probably even more broadly, right? So the idea being here that people act in their own self-interest and that somehow helps the collective, even though it's not necessarily intended to do that. But of course, Adam Smith didn't just write this sentence. He wrote a lot of other sentences that people don't pay as much attention to as this one, and he also wrote an entire book that people don't generally pay as much attention to as Wealth of Nations, called The Theory of Moral Sentiments, which is the book that behavioral economists find equally compelling. And in there he has quotes kind of like this: "We sometimes feel for another a passion of which he himself seems to be altogether incapable, because when we put ourselves in his case, that passion arises in our breast from the imagination, so it does not in his from the reality." So that book is chock full of quotes like this, which really capture this idea that we do sort of care about other people in a way that's not strictly rational. So with that sort of as a motivation, behavioral economists have built this whole field within the area of economics around whether or not people are truly rational, as most economists think today. And I think I wanted to try to capture this question of who are we as people, and I'll kind of give you the economist's view first. So they sort of have this view of everyone being kind of Spockish. I'm not a Star Trek fan, but I know that there are probably a number out there. But Spock is known for his sort of cold, calculating rationality, with quotes like this being frequent on the show. May I say that I've not thoroughly enjoyed serving with humans. I find their illogic and foolish emotions a constant irritant. So people watch Spock and they think, well, that's a strange person. He's very calculating. He's very rational. And behavioral economists agree. They think that Spock is what we would call an econ, which is a person that economists study. Right? They sort of study people as acting a lot like Dr. Spock here. But behavioral economists take on maybe a slightly dimmer, but I think slightly more realistic view of who humans are more like, and we kind of jokingly refer to Homer Simpson as a sort of prototypical human, and these quotes kind of capture, I think, the way behavioral economists do think about people. We have trouble with ourselves at times, right? So we know what we should be doing, and we sometimes find it hard for ourselves to win a battle with our own mind. So We're kind of more interested in studying humans, and the traditional economists, behavioral economists would argue, are a little more interested in the econs of the world. But when our view is we really want to understand what drives real people to do real things in the real world, and that's not always just cold calculating rationality or self-interest. So I'm going to kind of run through a number of different challenges as I see them that I think are related to this question of resource sharing, but I hope that they can be applied more broadly to your general lives, not just in your work, but just your daily lives as well. Since I have you all here, I can hopefully give you some insights for from the social sciences for like general. So the first challenge I wanted to talk about was cooperation and pro-sociality. We define cooperative and pro-social behavior in social sciences as when you suffer a personal cost to benefit the greater good. So that could be your colleagues, it could be society in general. And I would argue this is a concept that's at the heart of many nonprofits, right? So a lot of people in the nonprofit sector are either sacrificing through potentially lower salaries than they would get in other fields, harder work, more stressful work at times, kind of because there's a greater ambition. So you get some sort of psychic benefits from knowing that you're part of something bigger. And I think this is also a relevant idea when it comes to resource sharing in particular, so not just the broader enterprise of nonprofits, but also how do you make that decision to share resources with other organizations or across your own organization? I think often it requires us to take on the cost and to the greater good's benefit, and that can be a challenge to overcome. And so I want to talk about some of the barriers, and I think some of these will hopefully seem sadly familiar. The first and foremost one that pops to mind is this idea of the free rider. So you may have heard this expression before. We're referring to here a scenario where everyone is putting in a little bit of work and it's going to benefit the collective good, but they're all suffering through it. And you've got the one guy, on the hall, or the one organization in the group who's sort of happy to take advantage of all the other people's hard work, and sort of everyone else is doing a great job and they get some credit for it, but they don't have to work hard for it. So in the context of resource sharing, I think you can think about this a little bit as the dangers of atomistic thinking. So if you're really just thinking about your own thing or your own little segment of the organization, and you're not thinking more broadly about how do we improve the collective, right? How do we move our collective ambitions forward, you can fall quickly into this free rider situation where everyone slacks off a little bit and you kind of lose sight of the broader goals, right? You imagine a bicycle like this one where everyone's kind of pedaling a little bit slower because they know everyone else is pedaling and they kind of take the advantage of that as well. You can pretty easily get off course or fall way behind out of your mission. So the question is sort of how do we encourage cooperation in these environments where people have to suffer a cost for the collective good and they want to avoid doing that if at all possible. So I'll share a couple of insights from the social sciences. So the first is the idea of repeat interaction. So people like having a good reputation amongst their peers, and by repeat interacting with similar people over time, they develop that reputation, and then they also develop the potential to lose that reputation if they fall behind on it. So if and when possible, we want to encourage organizations to encourage repeat interaction in whatever context they work with, where they're trying to get more cooperation. Reciprocity is another key element. So the idea that we help people who help us. So when it comes to resource sharing, when it comes to inter-office dynamics, it's really important to be aware that there's a strong strain of social science literature suggesting that reciprocal altruism, or being nice to people who've been nice to you in the past, has powerful evidence in support of it across a number of disciplines. A third idea, which I think is very topical at the moment, is what we like to call observability. Right? So people essentially like being seen as having certain characteristics publicly. So many of you know this button or sticker, the I voted button. Many of you have driven by a number of lawn signs that proclaim people's party affiliations or political preferences. People like putting these things up partly because they're observable. I highly doubt that people have Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton lawn signs up on their bedroom walls, they have them out on the front lawn because they want to be seen as supporting the candidate of choice. You also probably are familiar with the famous ice bucket challenge, where people dumped ice water on themselves, and I bet a lot of them knew what they were doing it for, but I think a fair number of them just sort of did it because other people were doing it. They didn't really know the tie that much to ALS, but it was really intended to be a way for people to sort of project to the public, like, look, I care about this terrible illness that afflicts a lot of people, and I want to post on Facebook about it, and I want to be seen as someone who cares. And in this case, Mark Zuckerberg wanted to be seen as somebody who cared. So the basic idea there of observability, people want to be seen as pro-social. Even the hardest, most unpleasant people have somewhere deep down, they have a desire to be seen as sort of a good citizen. So if you can capitalize on that, either with language or with actual messaging, and that's the kind of thing we like to study experimentally, whether or not changing the way that you encourage observability of pro-social outcomes, either in the office or across other domains, might be a potentially powerful way to change behavior. Here's an example from one of my colleagues at the Yale Applied Cooperation team, Erez Yoeli and some co-authors. They looked at participation in a major electricity utilities program which was designed to prevent blackouts. So the idea was they were trying to get people to jump in and participate in this program to reduce blackouts overall, and they had residents either sign up, they had residents sign up in a communal area near their house, but they either had the sign-up sheet be sort of anonymous or one where they actually would name themselves. So they would put their name and unit number so it was visible to their neighbors that they had signed up for this pro-social activity. And as you can see from the graph, many more people signed up when they could write their name on the sheet than if they just put sort of an anonymous code that didn't reveal their identity. So people do seem to be driven to do pro-social things when they get some sort of visibility and credit for it. Another way to potentially strengthen cooperation is through social incentives. So a lot of organizations don't have unlimited financial resources, so they have to find other ways to motivate people to change their behavior. And in fact, some of our work suggests that social rewards can be as powerful or more powerful of a motivator. So I wanted to kind of touch on this nice paper by Ashraf and colleagues, which was looking into female condom distribution in Zambia. So the challenge in Zambia is that a lot of women sort of do want to use female condoms and don't feel empowered to do so, partly because there's sort of no natural place for them to get it. So what the researchers decided was, why don't we go to hairdressers in the community who have a pretty strong tie to the women and try to use them as a distribution channel to get female condoms into the hands of women. And so what they did was they did a randomized experiment whereby they varied the incentives for the hairdressers to provide these condoms to their workers, to their clients. I'm sorry. And they varied the kind of incentives that they provided. As you can see on this graph, there was a large financial incentive, there was a small financial incentive, and then there was a volunteering treatment where people weren't given any money for distributing condoms. They were just asked to volunteer if they'd like to do that. And again, this is independent of any normative judgment about whether they should or shouldn't be doing this. This is more about, we had an outcome that was seen as a development priority, and how do we best accomplish that. And you can see the large financial incentive did fractionally better than the small financial incentive, which did fractionally better than volunteering. But there was a fourth treatment, which was essentially a board that was put up in the back of the break room for hairdressers in this particular treatment, which gave sort of a sticker with a little star on it every time you distributed or sold a condom to one of your clients. And the STARS treatment, which is just about social observability of doing a good thing, there's no financial incentives at all tied to it, more than doubled the number of condoms that were distributed on a per person basis. So that's to say that people seem to be more motivated by getting a sticker in the break room than by a large financial incentive, and much more so, which was a big surprise to the researchers, but also pretty compelling evidence that social rewards can, in some contexts, be more powerful than giving people money. A second challenge I wanted to identify is what behavioral economists think of as present bias. So the idea here being that people prefer having things now to an almost irrational degree. So a simple example that many of you may have heard is, the question of, would you rather have a 20-minute massage right now, or would you rather have a 25-minute massage tomorrow? And many people would take the 20-minute massage now, whereas if I asked you if you'd rather have a 20-minute massage in 2 weeks and a 25-minute massage in 2 weeks and a day, most people would be willing to wait that extra day for the extra 5 minutes of massage. So this is this concept called present bias, and it can be a big motivator as well. I think there's a question, so I'll open it up to that.
Yeah, Sion. So this question has to do with the first challenge of the free rider problem, and we see this problem in a lot of shared spaces in the shared kitchen, where people take advantage of the fact that there's shared dishes, shared food, but nobody actually ever wants to clean up after themselves. So knowing what you know about pro-social behavior, if you were designing an ideal shared kitchen, what practices would you put into place?
That's a good question. That's a perpetual challenge, I think, at every organization on Earth. I think that part of it would be, people kind of look at the trade-off of time and cleaning, and they don't really see the connection. They sort of grumble about how dirty things are, but don't realize their small contribution to that. So I think one way to do that is with rules, right? So you can have, visibility, or making it a lot more observable when people don't follow through and clean their dishes. Now, part of that could be monitoring and so on, but you might also find that rules in the form of, there's somebody who is appointed to be in charge of that particular task, so you kind of delegate responsibility. There's some work that's being done through the World Bank around trying to basically assign leadership roles, even though they're sort of arbitrary, like you're the kitchen guy this week, can be a really powerful tool, because if everyone knows who the kitchen guy is, they know that that person is responsible, and so if the kitchen is dirty in a particular week, it's that person's fault. So rather than requiring everyone to clean up after themselves each time, which is highly unlikely, just kind of cycle around the responsibility for that. And we do that in our houses with chores and so on. Some of us less so than others, but certainly rules like that can be pretty powerful. And then, without getting to Big Brother, you could also just have monitoring systems whereby when people don't do it, they're shamed in some public way, right? So this is always rubs people the wrong way, but it's very, very, very powerful if you just have an anonymous Dropbox where you can people can note someone who they saw not cleaning up after themselves into the Dropbox, and every time you're named, your name goes up on the bullet board there or something as having been caught red-handed. You can make a little joke out of it, but I think it would motivate people to potentially not leave their dirty dishes behind. But it's a great question, and I wish I had a perfect answer, but there's certainly a number of things that I would think about testing, not all of which would necessarily fly, but certainly a few of which I think would work in a world of willing people, willing to test out solutions. Okay, so I'm going to keep moving here. Is that right? Or
yeah, go ahead.
Okay, great. Just in the interest of time here, I'll try to keep us going. So, back to this idea. We were talking about present bias, the idea that we prefer things now and earlier, which is not itself that strange, but we're especially prefer things to happen earlier when earlier means right now. And you can think about this quote that we hear all the time, we'll get to that later, and later never comes, right? Because now is always now, later is always available as a time to push things to. That's why all of us are going to the gym tomorrow, but very few of us are going to the gym right after the webinar. So a model for thinking about this that arises from behavioral economics is what's called a planner-doer model. So I want you to sort of envision a person sitting on an elephant And the person is what we would call the planner. So it's the version of ourselves that's thinking long run, that's thinking about, savings and retirement. It's thinking about, why am I in this industry to begin with? What does this organization exist to do? What's the mission? And then the doer is the day-to-day person, right? The person who's dealing with stuff as it comes up on a day-to-day basis. And that's really the elephant, right? So that's the person, or that's the being that's really in charge here. The planner tries to keep the elephant under control, but the elephant wants to, start an argument with the person down the hall and, be petty about this minor thing and respond to emails all day that have nothing to do with the mission of the organization. And it can be really hard for the planner to take control, right? So in the same way that's really hard for us to save enough for retirement because stuff comes up every day, it's really tough sometimes to keep the long view because we're so controlled by our doer, our person who prefers now and is kind of easily distracted by things in the short run. Another related concept, which I think, which arises from this terrific book called Scarcity, which I recommend to all of you, by a couple of good friends, Stendhal and Eldar, at Harvard and Princeton, respectively, is all about how scarcity in the world shapes our decision making. So I want to kind of be clear that we're not talking about money necessarily. It could be financial scarcity, but also time or cognitive scarcity. We're all restrained in some way and dealing with scarcity throughout our lives. And I want to kind of give a couple examples because I know that of the people on the call, we're not necessarily the richest people in the world, but we're certainly not the poorest as well. So when I think of scarcity, I think of this, right? So when my cell phone's about to die or my iPad's about to die or whatever, it's like it occupies my mental space in a way that's ridiculous, right? So I could just plug my phone in and it's not a big deal, but instead it kind of bugs me during that time when that bar is red. You're in a situation where your phone has now become a scarce resource. And it's not to say that it's terrible and it destroys your life, but it actually it distracts you in a way that could actually have detrimental impacts on other more important things in your life. Another example is packing, right? So when you're packing to go on a trip, I think all of us have experienced scarcity in that environment, and the authors really point to this as a great example. When there's that tiny little bit of space in your bag, it really makes you stress out about things that are really, you just get a slightly bigger bag. What's the big deal? But people tend to constantly come across this like, nothing fits in this bag. I'm dealing with scarcity. I'm stressed out because of it. When there's an easy solution, which is just to purchase a new bag. So how does scarcity manifest itself? Well, a couple of concepts I wanted to introduce, which the authors introduced in the book. The first is bandwidth. So we only have so much capacity to deal with things, right? And when we have a situation of scarcity, be it the phone charger, the luggage, or whatever, more serious cases of scarcity, they occupy our attention and they take up a lot of our bandwidth. So we have very little space left for the longer term important priorities. And so there's this concept that they also introduced called slack, which is like room to potentially spend time on things that matter more. And the author of the book, Eldar Shafir, had a great example that he told me about, which was, he says every day on his calendar he has a 1-hour meeting with himself. And the reason for that meeting is not that he actually wants to talk to himself, which, I mean, he's an entertaining guy, so I'm sure he would love to talk to himself. But it's more that he knows things are going to come up that he can't predict every day, and he wants there to be space in the schedule for him to deal with that stuff. So he's essentially building slack into his own schedule. So he has 7 hours a day of free time to schedule meetings and lunches and stuff like that. And he has 1 hour, which is for the inevitable stuff that's going to come up. And as you all know, if you're trying to schedule a meeting with someone and you have another meeting at the same time, you can just say, I have another meeting, and they're fine with it. So he says he uses that as an excuse to get out of meetings all the time. I have my meeting with myself then. So he just tells people, I have an important meeting, and they all think, wow, he's a very important guy, so he's got tons of meetings. But he's actually just sitting in his office putting out a fire that came up this morning. So what can scarcity do? Well, they argue that it can have what they call a focusing dividend, which is when you're in a scarce environment, you can get really good at focusing in on one task and just doing that one thing. So I think the classic example that I think affects all of us is email. So if you've ever had one of those days where you just sit down at your computer and you reply to emails all day, all of which are, in the grand scheme of things, relatively trivial, but you're plowing through the emails, you feel really good. On the one hand, that's great. You've focused effectively. But you've also done what's called tunneling. You focus in on one thing that may have nothing to do with the mission of your organization or your long-term goals. You've done a really efficient job of doing something that really in the grand scheme doesn't matter that much, where you might have been better off spending the whole day brainstorming about what you want to do with your career or your life or the organization, where it should be heading, and so on. So it can feel good, but scarcity can make us spend a lot of time focusing on the wrong thing. Okay, so the third area I wanted to talk about is the endowment effect. And I think this was particularly popular amongst folks at the conference that we held a few months back. The idea of the endowment effect is when people acquire something, they tend to raise their valuation of it beyond how much they valued it when they got it. So this little cartoon gives an example. This person may have been looking at the umbrella and was willing to pay $5 for it. As soon as they get it and unwrap it and put it, open it above their heads, they wouldn't sell it for anything a penny less than $45, right? So we overvalue things that we are endowed with and that we own. And this can lead to potential problems, right? So here's another little cartoon to capture the idea. You've got your 5-cent lemonade. You built this little stand here, and they're asking $1 million for their business because the growth rate supports this valuation, right? So you kind of overvalue your own things, and I think the direct application to resource sharing is clear, at least to me. When we have something that's ours and that belongs to us, and that especially that we built, which I'll talk about in a second, we tend to overvalue it. And that relates to this terrific piece of research on what is called the IKEA effect. And these researchers, what they did is they brought people in and they had them build furniture. IKEA furniture, we've all been there. Usually, hopefully, we've been the smiley face person and not the frowny face person here. But they had them build the furniture, and then they sort of asked them, okay, how much are you willing to pay for the furniture that you just put together versus we actually have the same piece put together by a professional. So it's, presumably done much better than you did it, right? So how much would you be willing to pay for that versus the one that you made? And they found that subjects were willing to pay 63% more for their own furniture that they potentially poorly made than one that was put together by a professional from IKEA. So this relates to this idea of the sunk cost fallacy. So when we put our time and energy and effort into something, we tend to sort of overvalue the thing that we are pouring our energy into, and so we end up devoting excess resources into things that we've put effort into in the past. So we've all been parts of projects where hours were spent before. The project is going nowhere. We all kind of know that, but we keep pouring effort into it. So this could be in the case of resource sharing. It might be better to share resources and not have to bear the whole burden, but instead we sort of irrationally cling to our thing because it belongs to us and we built it this way, and even though there's a better solution elsewhere. And this is a term that I like a lot, the not invented here syndrome, where we avoid things that were externally formed. So again, same idea, we built this in-house, it's ours. That other thing, sharing resources, doing that externally, that's done elsewhere, and that wasn't invented here, so they don't understand us, and we're not going to pursue it. So you may not end up pursuing potential opportunities that would be better for you to pursue than to just stick with your own thing. Quick note here, the research does suggest that when it comes to these sorts of biases, more experience and more feedback can help, right? So recognizing this problem, learning from this problem by kind of engaging with cases where this prevented an optimal decision can actually help people not make the mistake in the future. But a lot of organizations don't spend a lot of time thinking back to mistakes that they made when they held on to control too much. Can tend to be the bigger challenge there. Okay, so I want to move on to the next concept here. And I'll ask a quick question of you. Which of the following best describes what kind of driver you are? and you've got, I don't drive, but also a scale from 1 to 5, I'm not going to actually quiz you guys. I don't know if our sample size is big enough for statistical significance, but I will tell you that research shows that about 93% of the U.S. sample, but only, interestingly, 69% of the Swedish sample put themselves in the top 50% in driving ability, right? So most people think that they are slightly above average or well above average. Very few people say that they're below average, not just at driving, but at most things. And now we get a little title for our slide here, which is overconfidence. So overconfidence is a big problem. It affects a lot of different areas that social scientists are interested in, and I think it plays a pretty powerful role in organizations, especially in the leadership, at the leadership levels. And a related idea that can manifest for non-leaders is what's called a planning fallacy. So this is the tendency to underestimate how long we need to complete a given task. And usually this bullet point is enough for people to believe that this is true because we do this constantly. I think I might have had the planning fallacy with the number of minutes in this webinar, but that's all right. So no, I think I'm doing fine, I hope. So the planning fallacy is the idea, is an idea well demonstrated by this chart from a prominent paper in this area. So what they asked people to do is they gave, I think this was students, but they gave students an academic task, and they sort of asked them, how long do you think it would take you to finish this task? So kind of give me your best guess, and then an estimate that you're 50% confident about, 75% confident about, and then 99% confident about. So people, their best guess was, oh, this should take me about 6 days to do. They were 50% sure it would take them about 4, and about 99% chance sure that it would take them about 7 days to finish. And then when they actually gave them the task to do, it took them all, roughly 11 days to finish, which is much more than any of their best guesses. And those percentages you see on the 4 different bars there represent how many people actually finished them within those number of days that they had kind of guessed. So only 37% were able to complete the task in the time that they thought was their best guess. Right? So this is not surprising at all, at least to me. Most people think they'll get to that later today, but in fact they will get to it later this month. So this is kind of related to another idea that stems from overconfidence, the illusion of control. So we overestimate our ability. So when I say I'm going to get to that this afternoon, I kind of overestimate my likelihood of doing that because other stuff's going to come up, and I underestimate the probability of other stuff coming up that becomes more urgent, or I overestimate my self-control and my ability to kind of control the world around me. So I like this little cartoon here. It's from Calvin and Hobbes, one of my favorite comics. So you can see that Calvin is sort of trash-talking this plant and saying, you want some water, and like, haha, I control your fate, your lives are in my hands, without me you're as good as dead. But of course Calvin doesn't realize that other stuff is much more powerful than him, and the rain falling on the plant will take care of business for the plant. The plant doesn't really need him. So this kind of, for me, is unfortunately a lot of organizations, people think that they're in charge and that they can control outcomes much more than they actually can, and it's really the powerful forces of nature that are driving things forward, not necessarily our own control. And importantly, this is, and probably distressingly from our perspective, this is especially common in familiar or stressful situations. So when we're in a stressful environment or an environment that is familiar to us, we actually fall prey to this even more. So you might think, oh, I have a lot of experience in this area, or I started this company, so I surely know better the right direction to take it. Unfortunately, that makes you more prone, probably, to this bias, because it's a familiar situation. You feel that you have a lot of expertise in this area, and you have an emotional need as well to kind of control the outcome, because your emotions are tied in with the outcome. So you fall prey to the illusion of control even more. And that links nicely to the fifth challenge, which is identity. So all of us have many different identities. So, myself, I'm, a pet owner and a husband and a professor and a golfer or whatever, right? There's like lots of different things that I am. And when I'm in different settings in playing those roles, I behave very differently. Right? So the idea here is that identity can affect the social norm that we try to adhere to. So when I'm acting like a professor, I won't make certain jokes that I might make with my buddies because, they're inappropriate in that particular context. Or I won't wear clothes that I would wear if I was on the beach when I'm a vacationer because that's not the social norm for me in that particular environment. Now, these are trivial examples, but what's a more serious one? We can actually, if we're in a certain identity framework, we might try to maximize the wrong thing. So if I'm the CEO of an organization, or I'm the manager of a particular office, or I'm the head of a certain project, I might try to behave in the way that I think that role is supposed to behave and maximize the wrong thing. So you see this a lot with CEOs and COOs. They are in a prominent position, so they're trying to maximize control because that's what COOs and CEOs are supposed to do. They're supposed to be in control. They're supposed to be the leader. They're supposed to be the authoritative force. And then they end up maximizing the extent to which they act in that way, not necessarily maximizing the social good. And I think this is a pretty powerful reason for our behavior in a lot of settings, and it's something that we sort of forget when we go and walk into the office, that we're about to change identities and start maximizing something else from what we were maximizing before. So that's something to be aware of as well. The sixth and I think penultimate challenge that I wanted to talk about is this idea of loss aversion. And it's captured here by this little picture on a napkin. The pain from a loss exceeds the pleasure from an equivalent gain. So if you want an example of that, you can think about the last time you lost $5 from your wallet, and then also think about the last time you found a $5 bill on the street. Now this isn't true for everyone, but at least for me, and I think for a lot of people, when you find $5 on the street, you kind of get happy for a few minutes, you put it in your wallet, and then you pretty quickly forget about it. Maybe you tell your spouse or something that evening, and you feel a little boost of happiness again. But when you lose $5 from your wallet, or you forget, you overpay by $5 for an item in the store that was actually cheaper than the store next door, you feel so bad, and it affects your day, and then you can grumble about it, and you call yourself names in your head. It occupies a lot more, emotional energy for you when you suffer a loss. And so how might that manifest itself in an organization? Well, I would argue that organizations and leaders of organizations are loss averse as well. So they have excess fear of the downside of a situation. So when you're thinking about resource sharing, it might be, if I sacrifice this element of my organization, it's something I'm losing, and that's horrible, and it feels so terrible to give up a piece of myself, even though in reality, doing so may actually be better for the organization and better for the mission. And the final challenge is captured by this nice little visual. Some of you may have seen this, but this is a diagram of rates of consent to donating organs in 4 countries in Europe: Denmark, Netherlands, UK, and Germany. And these rates are all pretty low. And you notice the Netherlands is doing especially well. The Netherlands in the late 1990s had a mass mailing campaign where they sent letters to 80% of the residents in the country telling them about how important organ donation was. So I'm sure they were thrilled that they got this big uptick in organ donation rates, way above some of their neighbors. Unfortunately, Europe is a much larger continent, and there's a lot of other countries in Europe that are doing a little better than the Netherlands in terms of organ donation, in terms of overall rates. And so the question is, what's going on here? Why are these countries in blue doing so dramatically better than these countries in yellow, even though one of the countries in yellow is hugely committed to a campaign to try to get people to donate their organs? And some of you may know about this example already. The difference between the blue and yellow bars here is that with the blue bars, these are countries where people are assumed to be organ donors, and you have to check a box on a form to not be an organ donor, whereas the yellow countries, you have to check a box to be an organ donor. So the idea here, it's not a question of which one's better or worse. I want to be neutral about that. But this is evidence that people don't like checking boxes on forms, which is a pretty alarming thing to realize. And again, it gives us a nice title for our slide, which is status quo bias. So we have a bias towards not doing things and towards being inert, sticking with whatever the status quo is. And this can lead, importantly, to institutional inertia, right, in an organization. So I'm sure many of you have had conversations effectively like this, even though they weren't explicitly like this, what should we do? Let's just stick with what we're doing because that's the safest option. Let's not change anything right now. We'll discuss this later, kind of thing. And so how do we deal with this? How do we deal with institutional inertia and status quo bias? Well, there's a couple of insights from social sciences that have been replicated over and over. But one is incremental steps. So instead of trying to change the whole big thing, let's try to make small changes and hopefully kind of build up towards those bigger changes. They're less jarring, and importantly, they build trust and experience. So you learn that ceding control of something is not actually that much of a sacrifice. And you also see that you can trust other people. You can trust other people with parts of your organization. And it doesn't change your day-to-day so dramatically. And that can be a really nice way to sort of slowly start resource sharing more and more rather than just relying on going it alone. Another nice way to do this is anonymous internal reporting. So really explicitly asking people at an organization, what don't you like about the status quo? And do it anonymously, right? So like, what do you hate about how things are going on right now? What's the thing that ruins your day most every day? Collect that information anonymously from people internally. Similarly, what's the worst case scenario continuing with the status quo? So if we keep doing everything like we're doing now, what's the cliff that we're heading towards? What do you guys think? And finding that out anonymously from people, you might learn that a lot of people are worried about the same thing, but nobody's kind of acting on it because of status quo bias. So yeah, that basically wraps it up for me. I wanted to kind of open it up for questions from you all, but I did want to just put up some of my information here. So you can go to my website, or I guess that's my Twitter handle. I should put my email up here as well. It's just S, that's my first initial, and then my last name, Banot, and then the number 1 at swarthmore.edu. You can also find that on my website, so I encourage you to check that out. And again, as was mentioned, if these are the kind of things that you'd be curious to test out whether or not they work at your particular organization, I'm always all ears to those possibilities and would love to learn a little bit more about what challenges you're facing out there. So I guess I'll turn it over back to the group, but in particular, I'm curious if there are questions from all of you about anything I spoke about or anything that I may have implied.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much, Sion. I think there's a lot of really excellent nuggets throughout your presentation. I think the thing that really resonates with me at NCN, and having worked with so many groups that are starting shared space or starting shared services models, is that there's so much fear of change, that status quo bias you just spoke to, and that this sharing is a new way of working for so many organizations. And we've got some questions here that I'll go ahead and get us started with. But yeah, this is not necessarily our work in this sharing economy for social good is a new thing that not a whole lot of people have had the opportunity to practice. So one of the first questions I've got here goes back to this concept of self-interest, and that's not really the way we often think in the nonprofit world. We think of the mission and doing things in that pro-social lens, but I think what you were starting to get at was this idea of self-interest rightly directed. And do you have any ideas or thoughts about how we message the importance of self-interest back to the nonprofits that we work with?
Yeah, so I think that's a big challenge, right? Because especially in this field, you've got a lot of people who are rightly thinking about things in a social way, and potentially worryingly, they also think that that's how they're thinking, right? So they think, oh, I'm working at a nonprofit. I'm a charitable person. I'm not self-interested. I am pro-social all the time. That defines me. But then day-to-day things happen, and I would argue that all of us act a little bit more self-interested in our day-to-day lives than we sometimes like to tell ourselves that we are acting, I think. So that doesn't make us not good people. It's just how a lot of people make decisions in the workplace, and they won't volunteer for things. They might feel a little bit more petty about a certain thing that they don't want to see to someone else in the office because they don't really like that person. And it's not about the sort of collective anymore. So in thinking about like how do you speak to people on their level, well, again, trying to get people in that identity framework where you're kind of reminding them that like you're in this not because of yourself. You're in this because of this broader good. And coming back to the mission as much as possible, I think a lot of organizations kind of say, well, the mission is up on our website. And we all abide by it. And they do think about it sometimes. But we respond a lot to priming and just things that are made more salient to us. So we respond to what's in front of us. And if the more you can emphasize sort of all of us are here because of this social good, all of you are interested in maximizing your impact on this social outcome. I think the more people would take on that role of being in that identity framework and not so much in the I'm an employee, working on a report, which kind of takes you a little bit away from the mission. So it's hard to do that. I don't know that there's an obvious answer for here's the guaranteed way to get people to think selflessly, but that's certainly what I would be trying to do, is to get people into that mindset, into that identity as much as possible.
Thank you. Here's another question that's come in. I've heard people talk about how hard it is to collaborate because of how messy and painful it is. But I've also heard that if you get through an initial pain period or a high-cost period at the upfront, you'll get to the benefits, essentially, after you get over that learning curve or that initial hump. Has there been any research on this that you're aware of?
Yeah, so this is actually, a lot of this research is related to this concept of present bias that I discussed. So the economic models of present bias perfectly explain why people don't collaborate, as you described, right? So you mentioned that there's a tough period up front. It's messy. There's frictions. It's a little disorganized, and people really don't enjoy that beginning phase. And then you really reap the benefits later on. So this is the classic kind of thing that people are bad at doing, right? So a rational person would say, do the benefits in the future outweigh the costs in the present? And I'm going to think logically about the present and the future. But if you're present biased, you overweight what's happening now. So as a result, those costs that you described in the short run, stand very strongly in your mind, and the long-run benefits, which are not just coming in the future, but they're also somewhat uncertain. And we don't like uncertainty. We don't like things that are ambiguous, or they might work or they might not. We like more certainty as well. Those things combine to make us think, why would I want to pay a cost now, and I really care about now, to maybe get some benefit later, even if the expected value of this particular effort is positive. So this has been shown over and over. People don't go to the gym enough. People don't save enough. People don't invest in long-run projects enough. Even to the extent that people don't buy enough stocks, they buy too many bonds. So people look at that as well as an example of people wanting a little bit lower risk profile than maybe they rationally should prefer. So there's lots of examples of this research, and I think it very much fits in with what you described. I know there's also some work on sort of groups and social settings trying to complete tasks, and they find very similar things to what you described, that there's a powerful role for present bias and time inconsistent behavior in explaining what you see. So then I think the challenge, or the best tool for that, that social scientists have so far, is the idea of pre-commitment, right? So when you're in planner mode, when you're not in doer mode, when you're in planner mode, you take advantage of that opportunity and say, why don't we constrain doers from now on by making a commitment to engage in this particular activity when you're in that planner mentality, and make it a commitment where if you go back on doing this project, you suffer some real cost. So you're essentially locking yourself in. This is almost like telling a buddy that you want to go to the gym every Tuesday and Thursday, because now you do this in a moment of reflection, but when Tuesday comes, you're almost lying in bed, you really don't want to go, but last week I told Jimmy I would go with him, and now I look terrible if I don't show up and all that, so I guess I have to go, even though you kind of don't want to anymore. In the long run, it'll benefit you, you'll get your exercise and so on, and it's because you pre-committed. You kind of locked yourself in, you kind of bound your hands to some extent. So I think that's the tool that you would try to use as much as possible, get people to make publicly observable commitments to following through on a particular collaborative task. Commit to doing it collectively, right? So everyone gets together and says, we're all going to do this, let's make this observable, let's put it up on the board, we're all in on this. you can't back out, right? So now people might grumble about it later, but when you were all in the thoughtful planner mode, you made the commitment that's best for you all.
Yeah, it sounds like one of those unfortunately two rare occasions where a large meeting is really incredibly useful in getting those public commitments.
Right.
So one of the challenges, there's another question, is that this group is saying that their board is what's obstructing our efforts to collaborate with others. They're the ones that should be playing that planner role and not the doer role. What tips would you have for working with boards that are kind of holding a group back from resource sharing?
Right. So, I mean, I think board's a really tricky thing. I mean, we discussed this at the conference that we went to as well. Because they hold so much power and they can shape so much of what's going on. So I think you want to make an appeal as much as possible to their sense of identity, to their sense of efficiency as well, and also recognizing that they have their own territory to protect, right? So they're trying to do, they're kind of serving a role of like maybe trying to maximize control of the organization or whatever the case may be. They're not necessarily always thinking about the mission, which is, I think in and of itself an important and different thing to think about, right? So I think a lot of people think of the board as upholding the standards of the organization and the mission of the organization, but in reality they're often doing something else and they're trying to maximize their own thing. So one way to do this that I've seen be pretty effective is, do anonymous, like I mentioned here, anonymous voting, right, on certain things. So people may not be willing to take a public position on changing the status quo because they don't want to stand out as that particular person, right? But maybe everyone on the board does kind of think that something is not working, but they don't want to be the person who brings that up. And so the more you can kind of introduce some sort of, all right, let's be real, but let's be anonymous, and then let's think about like worst case scenarios. I know we talked about that at the NCN conference, and it was a pretty popular idea. Let's all put ourselves in the mindset of what's the worst thing that could happen, and then what can we do as an organization to prevent that worst thing from happening. That kind of can get people to start thinking in the mindset of sort of taking advantage of loss aversion, right? So let's put out the worst case scenario in this particular domain about resource sharing, and then ask the question of, okay, so how would we avoid that worst case scenario? And that's when you can potentially introduce resource sharing as a sort of a gamble that would potentially be beneficial and worth it to help alleviate the potential worst case scenario. But I think a lot of people go into it more in we want to do things this way, and the board has status quo bias as a collective. So they say, well, or let's do that later, or nah, it sounds like too much of a change. So you never really get them on board because you're asking them to do something pretty drastic, and they're kind of happy as things are, and they never kind of are thinking about the long term. So I think trying to find these new innovative strategies, and I don't have a perfect answer. This is the kind of thing you want to test around and experiment with. But I would think that anonymous reporting and really putting people in the loss mindset of like, well, here's the worst thing that could happen in this space to our organization, I think can get people to think very differently.
Fantastic. Well, Theon, that is all the time we have for questions right now. I really appreciate you taking the time today to spend with all of us. And for the rest of the participants here on the webinar, we are about to release an email with a link to download the final report from Streamlining Social Good, the gathering we held in Philadelphia back in April. So if you're interested in reading more about what we talked about around the barriers to nonprofit resource sharing, I encourage you to check out our website, go to this link on the screen, and download your own copy. Also for the participants, our next webinar will be down the road in November. We'll be focusing back on the ever-popular topic of fundraising for shared space. We'll be joined by Meena Gainpal Singh, a fundraising consultant based out of Ottawa, Ontario, who had a really popular webinar with us last year on how to fundraise for operating support. So she's going to come back, rejoin us, and help us with crafting strong case statements for shared spaces. So I'm really looking forward to that. And if there are any questions, we'll be sending out the slides and a recording of this webinar here in the next week or so. Feel free to reach out to any of us here at the NCN team, and we'll also send out Zion's contact information as well in case any of you are interested in being a living laboratory for one of his behavioral economics experiments. And with that, we will see you all in a month. Thank you so much. Thank you, Zion.
Great, thank you.